The footy's back, but do Aussies get a fair deal on streaming services?
Well, Stan adds offline streaming, but is that enough to compete with Netflix?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Alcatel. Welcome to Vertical Hold, the tech show where we channel surf through the headlines in search of the big picture. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined as always by a man who needs no introduction, Alex Kidman. We're also joined by Marc C-Scott, lecturer in screen media at Victoria University. Marc, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So we'll be kicking around the prospects for this year's sports streaming and examining Stan's recent push into offline streaming. But first, over to the tech news desk. Alex, what's new in tech?
Apple has announced a new iPad model, replacing the iPad Air 2, with prices starting at $469 for a 32GB Wi-Fi only version. It's also announced new Project Red iPhone 7 models and a storage bump for the iPhone SE family, up to 32GB and 128GB respectively.
Optus has backed down on its 30-day disconnection threat designed to push cable broadband customers to the NBN. Customers threatened with disconnection have begun to receive letters from Optus apologising for the inconvenience our error may have caused you. Optus has publicly committed to a 90-day switchover window for cable customers, which still falls far short of the 18-month window preferred by NBN Co.
Google has released its first developer preview of Android O, the next major upgrade for its mobile operating system. While we don't yet know what the O will stand for, we do know about a few key features, such as the ability to snooze notifications, the ability to swap out stock lock screen shortcuts for apps of your choice, and picture-in-picture video. Android O will release later this year, presumably first on the Pixel and Pixel XL phones.
Speaking of Google, it's adding the ability for iOS and Android users to share their location on Google Maps in real time, as well as mark where they parked. Google says the location sharing feature is aimed at helping friends find each other in crowded places. To allay privacy concerns, Google will remind users both in the app and via email of whom they're sharing their location with to help them manage their privacy. So Alex, are we at the point now where Apple's just iterating rather than innovating with these new iGadgets?
Well, it's hard not to see this week's releases as pretty much that story, because what we got an iPad, not an iPad Pro, but an iPad which is basically, here's the technology we pretty much already throw in the iPad Pro, but it's a bit cheaper, which is no bad thing. We got a shiny red iPhone 7 and iPhone 7 Plus, which is essentially Malibu Stacy in a new hat. And we got an upgrade for the iPhone SE, which was a really odd one because usually Apple upgrades its phones on a yearly basis. It is literally a year to the day since they upgraded the iPhone, since they announced, I should say, the iPhone SE, and yet the upgrade that we got was just a storage bump. So that's a phone that's still based on the much older iPhone 6S hardware, which at this stage is a generation and a half behind. Give it 6 months, it'll be 2 generations behind. When you're 2 generations behind in iOS land, that's typically the time when you're starting to become completely obsolete.
So Marc, are you an Apple man or an Android man?
I'm an Apple man, unfortunately, for some people.
Yes, that's all right. I too bear that affliction. Anything in these announcements appeal to you?
I'm probably at the end where I used to love the innovation that Apple were doing across all their products, but the iPhone just doesn't seem to be cutting it the way it used to. So, I think it's this year's the 10-year anniversary from the original iPhone. So I'm hoping maybe later in the year something big is going to get announced.
So Adam, it's sports seasonal. Big Australian sports season, I should say. Long-time listeners will be well aware of my own particular non-interest in sports generally. But the streaming rights this year are really complicated, aren't they? The rights for who's got which for free-to-air and which for internet and which for subscription. Can you talk me through it?
Which way is the wind blowing and which screen would you like to be looking at and who do you barrack for and who do you subscribe to? Yes, Sports Ball is back, and the only thing harder than picking the winners is picking how you're going to watch it. We're in the first year of a new deal for the AFL between Foxtel and... Now I've got to get this right, 7 and Telstra. And in the last year of the NRL deal with Foxtel and 9 and Telstra. So they're going to start a new deal next year. And it becomes very complicated. Do you want to watch it through Foxtel? Do you want to watch it through Telstra so you can only watch it on this screen size? Now, Mark, you've followed this issue over the years of rights deals and Foxtel on pay TV. What do you think of the deals that we have this year, and what do you think it shows for where we might go in the future?
Yeah, I guess you look at it sort of from two ways. You look at it from a consumer's perspective, and consumers really just want to pay or be able to watch it on any screen. That's what they're doing now. They're not wanting, for example, Netflix. They can watch it on their smartphone, they can move across to their mobile devices, be at the same point and watch that. Unfortunately, due to the media rights that we have for sport, it's just not that easy at the moment. And, these rights are up until 2020, 2022. So it's probably not going to happen in the near future that we can actually do something like, the way we watch Netflix.
Yeah. And I think that's what people want. It's like, I did the right thing. I gave you some money. Why are you making my life more difficult? Yeah,
it's really, I want to be able to watch it on my TV. I want to jump in the car and see the latest stats or wherever the game is up to. So it's frustrating from a consumer's perspective, but we have to look at the other side, which is the business perspective. These organisations are business, and they want to gain as much as they potentially can out of their media rights. So we have three groups. We have our free-to-air television broadcasters, we have our pay television broadcasters, and we have a digital rights. And so that's why we're seeing some of these glitches across these multiple screens, is they're all just trying to get as much as they can out of that piece of pie that they have.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency for people to kind of think of their team as this, little local grassroots thing. And the reality is, and this has been the case for decades now, that they are multi-million-dollar businesses and they're just interested in making as much as possible. But Netflix, I think, is an interesting example there, because the one thing, of course, Netflix really doesn't have is sport. It's their huge weak link.
Which is why they can do what they do, because they don't have to mess around with sports rights deals.
Yeah, I mean, they've still got issues around their rights in terms of content, because then we have the issues around regions, and that creates whole other issues. And that's really why they're pushing to produce so much original content, is because they can then distribute that globally and not have to worry about these regional rights.
One of the things that I like that they've managed to improve under the new AFL deal that starts this year is a bit less discrimination depending on which screen you're watching. It used to be you could sign up for Foxtel Play, which is the streaming service, because you didn't want a full Foxtel go and think, great, I'll watch the footy. Oh, but there's one match missing every round. Why? Oh, just because we felt like annoying you. Okay, well, I'll watch it on my computer like I can with other Foxtel Play stuff. Oh, no, sorry, can't do that. It only works on phones. So they really, there was this blackout thing, and it really just seemed like to annoy you to the point where you just pay for Foxtel. That blackout pretty much seems to have gone now. If you pay for Foxtel Play, I think maybe the only match you might not see is the grand final. But you don't have to worry each week, will my team draw the short straw and be the one that misses out? It's going to work on the Telstra TV. It seems to me, Mark, that the Telstra service, rather than the Foxtel service, is the one that's getting more complaints these days.
Yeah, I mean, I did subscribe to the AFL app over the last couple of years, and
that's the Telstra one, right? The AFL app is the Telstra deal?
Yeah, but the issue there is you can buy it through your iOS, so you can hit subscribe and it'll go as if you were purchasing via an app. The issue I had when I subscribed that year was I couldn't then log onto my desktop and watch it via my desktop, because I'd purchased it actually through my iOS app. So I had some dramas around that. So it's like, I've paid, but you won't give it to me on my desktop. It's a strange model, and I think there's plenty of bugs still there, and hopefully they're starting to iron some of those out.
It gets even more convoluted as well. If you want a really easy solution, if you want a sport to follow where you can get kind of maximum rights for minimum stress, the solution would seem to be to follow netball. I went to the launch of Telstra's new apps for AFL, NRL and the netball, and as they have the rights for all of those and they produce the apps for all of those. And for your AFL and NRL fan, well, yeah, you can watch on a small screen. I think it's up to 7 inches. Telstra has the rights for. But you can't, for example, use AirPlay or Chromecast to send it up to a bigger screen if that's what you want to do. The netball deal is that new, and netball's a smaller sport in the sense of TV ratings and audience participation kind of stuff. Certainly nothing against netball per se. But because it's that way, Telstra's been able to cut a deal where they've said, yeah, actually, you can send that up to a larger screen. We're okay with that. So perhaps the solution is just to switch codes.
That's it, yeah. You've clearly grasped sport now that you know that it's easy to just go, I'll go from football to netball. I'm so proud of you, Alex, that you've come this far.
I'm a Hawthorn supporter, so I reckon we've had our couple of years. So, yeah, okay, I'll change to netball this year. Yeah.
I'm a Bulldog supporter. I'm a Footscray supporter. We're on the top. I'm not getting out now. I've been waiting my whole life for this.
It's especially kind of disappointing, though, because if you look at a lot of global codes, they do this stuff a lot better. They're probably 5-10 years ahead of where we are. If you look at any of the big US sports, they've all got their own dedicated subscription services where they just basically say, pay us some money, watch the stuff.
Do you think part of the problem, Mark, is that they have this fragmentation where digital rights is considered a separate thing? And will we get to the point where digital rights is just part of rights and that will make it a bit easier?
You would hope so, but unfortunately, the amount of money that's being spent on media rights in Australia, and AFL is a prime example, it probably does require the three parties to actually come in to actually fund that. Yeah. And so that's part of the problem as well.
And I would think it suits the AFL to break it up because they can charge more for it in pieces, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that could be part of it. The other thing about the US is it's a much bigger country. I mean, what I think might happen is we'll start to see some different models, not necessarily in these higher tier sports, but in more the lower tier and those grassroots. So you've already mentioned netball it's not necessarily lower tier, but it's definitely lower than the AFL and the NRL. So I think that's where we're going to see these big shapes and moves.
Could you see a time where the AFL decides it wants to cut out the middleman and go with a direct service rather than through someone like Foxtel?
Not in the near future, but we could see it where it breaks. You know, if you're a Bulldog supporter, maybe part of your membership gives you access to a Telstra-type TV where you get access to all of the Bulldogs games streamed. So maybe they might break it down in that way, potentially.
I guess the risk for the AFL is if they're getting, I think it's $2.5 billion over 5 years, this deal. So $500 million a year. If you want to go direct and cut out Foxtel and you want to charge, I don't know, $100 or whatever subscription, it's a hell of a lot of people you got to sign up to hope that you make the money that you could have made out of Foxtel. You got to be pretty confident to make that move.
Yeah, I think the other thing is they need to look in. This is not just a game that's viewed by Australians. It needs to be an international game. Once that happens, then you'll start to see those numbers increase.
So, Alex, Stan's finally offering offline content. What can we watch?
Well, it's much the same approach that Netflix took when it announced it. It's much the same approach, in fact, that Amazon Prime also offers, although, of course, they have a very, very tiny library, in that if you're on a mobile device, so that's a smartphone or a tablet, nothing else, then instead of streaming content through Stan, you can preload it to your device so that you can watch it either for those periods where you've got no internet connectivity, so if you're outside the capital cities in a lot of cases, and travelling, or especially if you get on a plane or something like that, or for those times, of course, where you just don't want to burn through mobile data because video is incredibly data intensive. So they're offering most of their library. Their big claim was that it was the majority of their content, and I was curious to see exactly how accurate that was. So with my day job hat on, I actually kind of ran the data and worked it out. And it's fairly impressive in that about 65% of the TV series they've got, that's by title, not just by season, but by title, about 65% of those are available, about 69% of their movies. So it's not 100%. You will still find titles where you won't have a little download icon, but it's a pretty big number, and obviously, that does represent thousands of potential hours of viewing enjoyment across a whole bunch of genres. I have not yet done the full analysis against Netflix, but my gut feel, having used Netflix offline for some time, is they're probably doing better on a percentage term than Netflix is. I don't know that Netflix, of course, having a much larger library than Stan, might actually have more hours up its sleeves of content, although Netflix, of course, has some really big annoying gaps like all of the Marvel originals. None of
Netflix also gets a bit convoluted in you can only have stuff on your device for 30 days and this kind of stuff. What's Stan's approach to that?
Stan hasn't really made this entirely clear, and they only launched this week.
Yeah.
So I haven't really had the chance to dig into it to kind of work it out. I would not be surprised if it was a fairly similar kind of approach, because ultimately this also comes down to the rights that they can get for this content and keeping those rights holders happy. It's why there's no option for them to be on laptops or desktops or those kinds of devices, because they're worried about the piracy angle with allowing people to have these kinds of services active.
Yeah. So, Mark, are you a Netflix man, a Stan man, heaven forbid a Presto man?
Yeah, I mean, Netflix has been the go-to, but, I think it's interesting where we're at this point. So 2015 is really when all this kicked off. And at that stage, we had Netflix, we had Stan, we had Presto, and we also had QuickFlix.
Yes.
And now we're left with, the only local really dominant service is Stan. And then now we have Netflix, which we've had since 2015. Amazon's here now, HBO maybe could come, Hulu, and these are big media giants. So I guess my fear factor is where Australian content sits into this big picture.
That's interesting you said about HBO perhaps going directly, because that's what I was saying before about sports associations going directly. That's what HBO did in the US. They felt they were powerful enough that they could launch a direct model and say, well, screw our cable partners, what are they going to do about it? I wouldn't think they'd be at the point where they could do that here and think they would recoup the amount of money that they would lose from dealing with Foxtel. Do you think that is on a long-term roadmap, though?
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of looking at their market. So most of those subscribers, Australia's always seen as someone that they go to. Even YouTube Red, if we mention them. Australia was the first country outside of the US to gain access to that. So we're definitely seen as a market where we're willing to engage into new technologies and new ways.
The thing with HBO, though, their deal with Foxtel is multi-year. So they'd have to either wait that out or seriously limit what they were allowed to put on the service. And I think that's probably the challenge for Hulu, and it's very obviously the challenge that Amazon has hit with Prime Video here. The Prime Video catalogue is pathetic, frankly. It's really small. And admittedly, they're selling the service very cheap, and I don't think that's coincidental. But having just been in the UK, where Amazon Prime Video has existed for some time, you flick over to that content library and suddenly, my God, it's full of shows, as opposed to, well, I can watch the Grand Tour and Man in High Castle and then...
the Grand Tour again.
Yeah, the Grand Tour again. So any new player coming into this market kind of has to compete with that. And I guess for Foxtel, of course, the other challenge for them with that HBO deal, the figures for subscription TV that came out for late last year suggested that in terms of the stuff people are watching, it's Game of Thrones and then it's sports, and sports. Game of Thrones only has 2 short seasons to go, and then HBO's import probably drops a little unless it can come up with another Game of Thrones-esque hit.
The other option, what we were talking about with sport, is maybe the HBO app is limited to mobile devices. Again, it's going to frustrate consumers, but there's different ways that they could look at the model. So Foxtel is still getting a premium for their service as well.
That would actually make a lot of sense. You're right, it would annoy people, but it would give them a way to get a foothold in while still being able to say to Foxtel, it's okay, we're not totally stepping on your toes.
Yeah, we've got digital rights as such, but we're not going into the pay service anytime soon.
So, Mark, there are also social media services that are getting into sports streaming. I mean, Twitter's done stuff with the NFL, for example. Facebook's got its fingers in a few pies. Do you see them as being significant sports players?
Yeah, I think the Twitter model's interesting, what it was doing with the NFL and streaming those games. It actually got a pretty cheap deal in terms of getting rights for those Thursday night games in comparison to what CBS and NBC were paying for those. But it's interesting that they've also come out to Australia and actually streamed the Melbourne Cup last year. The difference there was it really felt like a Channel 7 broadcast just being streamed on Twitter. The presenters had their 7 branded microphones. But it's an interesting mix, and I think that they're definitely going to be starting to look at sport. There's been rumours of whether they might go to A-League and look into their new broadcast rights. So there's definitely some scope there for Twitter to become essentially a sports broadcaster.
It's not what I think of when I think of Twitter.
It's definitely not. It's we think of Twitter. It's I think it's still trying to find where it sits in the mix as well, and that's sort of changed over times. I mean, Facebook, it now has competition from Facebook. Even locally, the Women's Big Bash League this year was streamed. So they had 59 matches in 50 days. 47 of those games were actually streamed on the Facebook page for Cricket Australia.
Okay.
They weren't the big, multiple cameras that we normally have at a cricket broadcast, but there was 4 cameras with commentary. So it's interesting the play that they're sort of having there. The other issue around Facebook is we had the recent Green and Mundine fight where someone paid for the pay-per-view for Foxtel and then streamed it to their friends on Facebook. So there's various ways that this could go.
Well, that's the final bell tolling on another episode of Vertical Hold. Got any thoughts about the topics we've discussed this week? Drop us a line via Twitter or the Vertical Hold Facebook page. Thanks to Marc for joining the show this week.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks everyone for listening, and remember, if you like what you hear, hit that subscribe button. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Alcatel.